Get on your knees, now! I said get on your knees! Hands up where I can see them!
Sir, what's going on?
Don't ask questions! Get on your knees!
I'm just loading groceries.
You're gonna be a problem if you don't do what I say. Now get down, I'm not gonna tell you again!
There's a moment in every person's life when everything they thought they knew about the world just stops making sense. For Marcus, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a grocery store parking lot, surrounded by bags of fresh vegetables. He was 53 years old. He had spent 31 years wearing a badge, 31 years protecting people who would never know his name. He'd walked into burning buildings. He'd talked down armed men in the middle of mental breakdowns. He'd held the hand of a dying woman after a car accident, stayed with her until the paramedics arrived, then went home and cried in his bathroom for an hour. He'd done all of that. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. Tap like and hit subscribe, because here we don't just tell stories. We tell stories that stay with you. And on this Tuesday, under a cloudless Texas sky, none of it mattered, because all anyone could see was a black man loading groceries into his trunk. Let me take you back to the beginning of that day, because the truth is, it started like any other day. Marcus woke up at 6. He kissed his wife, Elena, on the forehead while she was still half asleep. He made coffee. He read the news on his phone. He felt the familiar ache in his lower back from an old injury, a reminder of a foot chase from 15 years ago that ended with him tackling a suspect through a chain-link fence. He was a deputy colonel now. He'd worked his way up from patrol officer to detective to sergeant to lieutenant to where he stood today. He'd trained hundreds of officers. He'd rewritten department protocols. He'd testified before city council about community policing initiatives. But that morning, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about tomatoes. Elena had asked him to pick up groceries on his way home from a meeting. She was making her grandmother's recipe for salsa, the one that required very specific tomatoes, the kind that were firm but not too firm, red but not too red. Marcus knew better than to come home with the wrong ones. 30 years of marriage had taught him that much. So after his meeting wrapped up around 2 in the afternoon, he drove to the grocery store near their neighborhood. It was a place he'd been to 100 times, maybe more. The cashiers knew his face. The manager once asked him about a security concern. It was familiar. It was safe. Or so he thought. Marcus took his time in the produce section. He picked up tomatoes, examined them, put them back, picked up different ones. He grabbed bell peppers, cilantro, onions, limes. He wandered through the aisles, added some other items Elena had mentioned, bread, milk, orange juice. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make anyone look twice. He checked out. The cashier smiled at him. She said, "Have a good day." He said, "You too." Then he walked to his car. It was a nice car, not extravagant, not flashy. Just a well-maintained sedan that he'd bought 2 years ago after his old one finally gave up. He'd worked hard for that car. He'd saved for it. He'd earned it. He popped the trunk open and started loading the bags. That's when everything changed. Marcus didn't see the patrol car pull into the lot. He was focused on arranging the bags so the tomatoes wouldn't get crushed. He was thinking about Elena's salsa. He was thinking about dinner. He wasn't thinking about the fact that someone was watching him. The voice came from behind him. Sharp, cold, authoritative. "Get on your knees, now." Marcus froze. For a second, he thought maybe he'd misheard. Maybe someone was yelling at someone else. Maybe this wasn't real. But then the voice came again. "I said get on your knees. Hands up where I can see them." Marcus turned slowly. There was a police officer standing about 10 feet away. Young, maybe early 30s. White. His hand resting on his holstered weapon. His face set in an expression that Marcus had seen before. Too many times before. It was the look of someone who had already decided who Marcus was before saying a single word. "Sir," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm, keeping his hands visible. "What's going on?" "Don't ask questions," the officer said. "Get on your knees." Marcus felt something cold move through his chest. He'd been in law enforcement for 31 years. He knew what this was. He knew exactly what this was. But knowing didn't make it hurt any less. "I'm just loading groceries," Marcus said. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. "Is there a problem?" The officer stepped closer. His hand tightened on his weapon. "You're going to be a problem if you don't do what I say. Now get down. I'm not going to tell you again." There was something in the officer's voice. Something that went beyond protocol. Something that went beyond procedure. It was the sound of a man who wanted Marcus to know he was beneath him. Marcus looked at the officer's face. He looked at his hand on the weapon. He looked at the empty parking lot around them, the way no one else was close enough to see what was happening. And he made a choice. Not because it was right, not because it was fair, but because he wanted to go home alive. Slowly, Marcus raised his hands above his head. Slowly, he lowered himself to his knees. Right there on the concrete. Right there next to his open trunk with bags of tomatoes visible just a few feet away. A 31-year veteran of law enforcement knelt on the ground because a patrol officer told him to. The concrete was hard. It dug into his kneecaps immediately. His hands were raised, palms open, fingers spread. He kept his eyes down. "That's better," the officer said. There was satisfaction in his voice. Marcus heard it clearly. The officer walked closer, standing over Marcus now, looking down at him like he was exactly where he belonged. "So, what are you really doing out here?" the officer asked. Marcus kept his voice calm. "I told you, I'm loading groceries. I just came from inside." "Uh-huh. You live around here?" "About 15 minutes away." "How'd you afford a car like that?" The question hung in the air. Marcus felt something twist in his stomach. This wasn't about groceries. This wasn't about the car. This was about something else entirely. "I work," Marcus said quietly. "I have a job." "What kind of job?" "A good one." The officer laughed. Actually laughed. "Ever been to prison?" Marcus closed his eyes for just a second, just long enough to steady himself. "No," he said. "Never." "Never been arrested?" "Never." "Not even a speeding ticket?" "Not even that." The officer circled around Marcus slowly, looking at the car, looking at the groceries, looking for something, anything that would justify what he was doing. "Those groceries yours?" he asked. Marcus almost laughed. Almost, but he didn't. "Yes," he said. "They're mine." "You got a receipt?" "It's in one of the bags." The officer walked to the trunk. Marcus heard him moving bags around, heard the rustle of plastic. He heard him find the receipt, heard him look at it, heard him put it back. Nothing. There was nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong to find. But the officer wasn't done. "You got any weapons in this car?" "No." "Any drugs?" "No." "You comfortable down there on your knees?" Marcus looked up then. Just for a moment. Just long enough to meet the officer's eyes. And what he saw there made everything clear. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about procedure. This wasn't about anything except making Marcus feel small. "Is this a new law?" Marcus asked quietly. "Making people kneel in parking lots?" The officer smiled. "I ask the questions. You answer them." Marcus stayed on his knees for 7 minutes. 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. 7 minutes with his hands raised and his knees aching and his heart breaking. 7 minutes wondering if this was how it would end. Not in a shootout, not in a high-speed chase, not in any of the dangerous situations he'd faced in his career, but here, in a grocery store parking lot, over tomatoes. Finally, the officer told him to stand. "Let me see your ID," he said. Marcus slowly lowered his hands. His shoulders were screaming, his knees were stiff. He reached for his wallet carefully, moving slowly, making sure every movement was visible. He handed over his driver's license. The officer took it and walked back to his patrol car. Marcus stood there, rubbing his knees, watching the officer sit in his car and type information into his computer. He knew what was coming. He knew what that screen was about to show. And he waited. Inside the patrol car, the officer entered Marcus's name into the system. The computer took a few seconds to process the information. Then the results appeared. Marcus watched through the patrol car window as the officer's face changed. He watched the color drain, watched the eyes widen, watched the exact moment the officer realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The officer sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen. Then he got out of the car. Slowly this time. Differently. He walked back to Marcus and handed him his license. "You're free to go," he said quietly. No apology, no explanation, just a dismissal. But Marcus didn't move. "I need your name and badge number," he said. The officer hesitated. "Why?" "Because I'm asking." Something in Marcus's voice made the officer reach for his badge. He read off the information. His voice was smaller now, quieter. Marcus took out his phone and typed the information in. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked. The officer didn't answer. "I'm Deputy Colonel Marcus Webb. I've been in law enforcement for 31 years. I've trained hundreds of officers. I've written policy. I've testified before legislators. I've dedicated my entire adult life to this badge." Marcus paused. "And today you made me kneel in a parking lot because you saw a black man loading groceries." The officer opened his mouth, closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. "Your body camera was on, wasn't it?" Marcus asked. The officer's face went completely white. Marcus got in his car. His hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was catching up. He put the groceries on the passenger seat, the tomatoes, the peppers, all of it, and he drove home. When he walked through the door, Elena was in the kitchen. She turned to smile at him, then stopped. "What happened?" she asked immediately. Marcus set the groceries down, and then for the first time in 31 years of marriage, he told his wife about something that had happened on duty that made him cry. He told her about the parking lot, about the officer, about kneeling on concrete next to tomatoes. Elena held him while he cried, and then she said something that changed everything. "You're going to do something about this, aren't you?" Marcus looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I am." Within 2 days, Marcus had filed an official complaint. He'd retained a civil rights attorney. He'd contacted local media. The body camera footage was released within a week, and the world saw everything. They saw the approach, the immediate command to kneel, the threats, the questions about prison and weapons and how Marcus could afford his car. They saw 7 minutes of a police colonel on his knees in a parking lot. The video went viral, millions of views, thousands of comments, news coverage across the country. The officer was placed on immediate administrative leave. An internal investigation was launched. 4 months later, he was terminated. But Marcus didn't stop there. He filed a civil lawsuit, not just against the officer, but against the system that had allowed this to happen. The case went to trial 11 months after the incident. The courtroom was packed every day. The body camera footage was played for the jury. They watched all 7 minutes. They heard every word. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They came back with a verdict that made headlines. Marcus was awarded substantial damages. The officer was held personally liable. The department was ordered to implement new training protocols. But for Marcus, it was never about the money. It was about the message. It was about making sure that what happened to him, a decorated law enforcement officer with 31 years of service, couldn't happen to someone else without consequences. The officer left Texas within weeks of the verdict. No other department would hire him. His name was toxic. His career was over. Marcus continued his work as deputy colonel, but he also became something else. He became a voice. He spoke at conferences about implicit bias. He consulted with departments on use of force policies. He trained officers on de-escalation and community relations. He turned the worst moment of his life into a platform for change. Years later, Marcus still drives past that grocery store sometimes. He doesn't shop there anymore, not because he's afraid, but because he doesn't need the reminder. But sometimes when he's driving by, he thinks about that Tuesday afternoon. He thinks about the concrete on his knees, the ache in his shoulders, the humiliation of kneeling next to his own groceries. But he also thinks about what came after. He thinks about the verdict, the changes. The officers he's trained who came up to him and said, "Thank you for teaching us how to be better." He thinks about the young black man who approached him after a conference and said, "My father was pulled over last year. He didn't have a camera. No one believed him. But because of you, our department changed their policies. Thank you." That's what Marcus thinks about now. Not the kneeling, but the standing up. One evening, about 3 years after the incident, Marcus was making dinner. Elena was sitting at the kitchen table reading. The evening light was coming through the window in that particular way it does in late summer. Marcus was cutting tomatoes for a salad. He paused, knife in hand, looking down at the red fruit on the cutting board. "You know what's funny?" he said. Elena looked up. "What?" "I still buy tomatoes from that store sometimes. I send someone else to pick them up, but I still buy them." "Why?" Marcus set the knife down. "Because they're just tomatoes," he said quietly. "And I'm not going to let what happened take that away from me. I'm not going to let it take anything else away." Elena smiled. She walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. "You know what I think," she said. "What?" "I think you're the strongest person I've ever known." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not strong. I just decided that kneeling on that concrete wasn't going to be the end of my story. It was going to be the middle. The part where everything changed." He picked up the knife again and went back to cutting tomatoes. "The part where I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear. Refuse to be silent. Refuse to accept that this is just how things are." He paused. "And maybe, just maybe, if enough people refuse, things actually change." Elena kissed him on the cheek. "They already have," she said, "because of you." Marcus finished cutting the tomatoes. He added them to the salad. He and Elena sat down to dinner together, the way they had for 33 years. And somewhere across the country, in a training academy, a young officer was watching body camera footage from a case study about de-escalation and implicit bias. The officer watching was black. She was 24 years old. She'd just graduated from the academy, and she was watching footage of a man named Marcus Webb kneeling in a parking lot. Her instructor paused the video. "This," the instructor said, "is what happens when we forget that every person we encounter is someone's father, someone's husband, someone with dignity and a life and a story we know nothing about." The young officer watched the screen. "This man," the instructor continued, "was a deputy colonel with 31 years of service. But even if he wasn't, even if he was just a man buying groceries, what happened here was wrong. And it's your job to make sure it never happens on your watch." The young officer nodded. She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about the 7 minutes on concrete. She thought about the courage it took to stand up afterward and demand change. And she made a promise to herself. She promised that every person she encountered in uniform would be treated with dignity, with respect, with the humanity they deserved. Because of a man named Marcus Webb who knelt among the tomatoes and then stood up to change the world. That's how change happens. Not all at once. Not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but with one person deciding that enough is enough. One person deciding to speak when it would be easier to stay silent. One person deciding that their pain can become someone else's protection. Marcus Webb is still a deputy colonel today. He still trains officers. He still writes policy. He still serves his community. But now, when he goes to the grocery store, he does something different. He looks people in the eye. Every person he passes, every cashier, every stock clerk, every customer. He looks them in the eye and he sees them, really sees them, because he knows what it feels like to be invisible, to be reduced to nothing but assumptions and stereotypes, and he's decided that no one should ever feel that way again. Not on his watch. The parking lot still looks the same. Cars come and go, people load groceries, life moves forward, but if you know where to look, if you know the story, you can see it differently. You can see that patch of concrete not as a place of humiliation, but as a place where something important happened, where a man knelt and then stood and then changed things, where pain became purpose, where injustice became action, where one Tuesday afternoon became a lesson that echoed across the country. The tomatoes are still there on the shelves. The parking lot is still open. The sun still shines the same way it did that Tuesday. But everything is different now, because Marcus decided it would be. And sometimes, that's all it takes. One person, one moment, one decision to stand up. Even after you've been forced to kneel, especially after you've been forced to kneel, that's when standing means the most. Before you scroll, if this story touched you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Like it, share it, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the soul. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.